but otherwise we will get things started. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Great to have you here. For those of you who don't know me, who haven't attended one of these before, my name is Nick Maturo. I'm a research coordinator at ELAN working on our Quebec Relations project. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. As I mentioned, video off and microphone muted would be preferable, just because it does help to minimize distractions for your fellow participants. It also sort of helps with Zoom call stability, I find, when we get a lot of people on there. And by all inclinations, or this seems like it's going to be a fairly popular Zoom session, so we may have a lot of folks joining us. I'd also like to take a moment to welcome a few members of the ELAN team who are joining us today. First, we have Swati Khanna, who is ELAN's program manager. Swati, as always, has graciously offered to moderate our Q&A period at the end of the session, so I am once again eternally grateful to her for that. Also joining us is Louise Campbell. Louise is a Montreal-based musician with a diverse background, including working as a performer, an improviser, a composer, and a community arts facilitator. But Louise is also here as a member of ELAN's own terrific art ed team, providing communications and artist support. And Louise will be sharing some of her expertise in that regard later in the session today. I think we were supposed to have ELAN's own #1 Guy Rogers, our executive director, joining us here today. I don't see him. I know he had a fairly busy day, so maybe he'll be joining us in the next few minutes. So if he does, we'll hear a few words from him. But without any further delay, this is the 8th in a series of webinars that we've been offering through our Quebec Relations project. For those of you who are not already familiar with the project, Quebec Relations is all about helping artists and arts and culture organizations access new funding through the provincial government. So we've also been offering more presentations via Zoom and trying to expand the kind of support that we're able to provide during COVID-19. So each month we're presenting a session on a range of topics that generally relate to funding for the arts. Today is a slight departure, but it's no less relevant for supporting your artistic practice, particularly in these uncertain times. So today we're going to be discussing how to have an effective digital presence in a way that works for you, as well as the benefits of promoting your practice online. Obviously, using the internet and digital tools has been a big thing for artists in recent years. Many of us have strong feelings about it one way or another. Some people have really embraced it with open arms, while others have preferred to just really steer clear and sort of rely on more traditional methods of promoting themselves. But clearly, as with many things, COVID-19 has really dramatically changed the game. So with in-person events pretty much on hold for the time being throughout most of the province, and greatly reduced opportunities for face-to-face networking, it's never been more important to consider how a strong digital presence can not only help you weather this storm, but can also be a major boost to your career in the future beyond this. So that being said, I do know it's a complex topic, and we have people joining us today with different sort of comfort levels, experience levels. So my goal with this webinar is really to try to help you approach this subject in a way that makes sense for you, that maybe helps you get out of your comfort zone a little bit while still respecting the ways that you like to work. And so in that sense, it'll be introductory, but I'll also touch on some more intermediate topics as well. So before we get started, just a quick outline of the webinar. First, we'll provide a bit of background on Quebec Relations, just to give you some additional context about our work and make you aware of some of the resources that we offer through the project. Then I'll talk a little bit about what it means to have an effective digital presence and why that's so important. So after that, I'm going to devote quite a lot of time to social media, since that's where I think a lot of you are either already focusing your attention or looking for some help getting started. I'll also discuss the benefits of having your own artist website beyond your social media profiles. I'm then going to provide an introduction to some more advanced topics, as I mentioned, such as search engine optimization and Wikidata, to get you thinking about strategic ways of boosting your online presence. Since I know a lot of you joining us today are part of ELAN's Art Ed project, we'll also take some time to highlight some of these specific considerations for the kind of content that you're able to share and the best ways of going about it. So taking things into account like privacy and permissions, of course. And at that point, I'll ask Louise to say a few words as well. Lastly, we're going to close off with a brief question period in the time remaining. So how that's going to work, you can type your questions into the Zoom chat window throughout the presentation. Swati will keep track of those for either myself or Louise at the end. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the time remaining. It is a fairly good sized audience today. So we'll try to move through this. Yeah, it's a fairly good sized audience. We'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can. If we run out of time, of course, I encourage you to get in touch via email. I'm happy to help you. So we have quite a bit to cover. I'll move through it at a fairly decent pace, but please just type a message in the chat window if it's moving too quickly. I'll also note that while this might be a lot of information, don't feel like you have to, get everything in your mind in one shot. I will be sharing the slides with everyone at the end of the session. That will also include a link to a Google Sheet full of additional resources, which I think will be useful and which I'll be sort of alluding to throughout the presentation. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions via email that come up once you've had a chance to look at those resources. So we'll also be uploading the archival recording onto our website sort of as soon as possible afterwards. So we'll make sure you're notified via email when that is available as well. So that said, time to learn a bit more about Quebec relations. I'm not sure if Guy, yes, Guy has joined us. So I'll hand things over to Guy to tell us a little bit about QR.
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I just want to give you a bit of the backstory on where these workshops come from. This project is funded by the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers because they're trying to increase the connections between English-speaking artists and the government of Quebec. They know that there are still many barriers, real or perceived. And so the work that Nick has been doing is to demystify what happens within the Quebec bureaucracy, to present information, and then to provide personal support in applying. So in every other webinar that we've done, we've made a point of stressing that this funding runs out on March the 31st next year, so grab it while it's fresh. Although I'm happy to announce that yesterday we had a meeting with the Secretariat, and the project is going to be extended for another 3 years, which is excellent because Nick has put so much work into creating the information on the website. Now he can update it, maintain it, and share it with you. So while the urgency of responding to this offer is not quite what it was a few days ago, I still urge you to contact Nick, make a personal contact, follow up on the information available, and find a way to connect yourself better with funding through the Quebec government. And then we can track the results and find out if there are problems, if additional support needs to be supplied, or if there is good news, then to share it with other people to encourage them to follow in your footsteps and respond. So maybe just on behalf of everybody, I see some comments going through, we could just congratulate Nick on having set up a great project that the Secretariat really appreciates, and the fact that we're going to be able to extend it for another 3 years, I think is fantastic news for the community. So thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Guy. Much appreciated. And yeah, we're, as Guy mentioned, we're very happy about the news that we just got. Looking forward to continuing to provide the support that we've already been providing, but also, come up with some great ideas about how we can expand that and really, give you the resources you need to succeed. So big things coming. Keep your eyes peeled for more news on that in the next few months. And thank you again, Guy, for joining us. I know it's a super hectic day for you, so much appreciated. All right, so with that said, I guess we'll get down to business here for the topic at hand. So I think right off the bat, what we need to do is ask an important and fairly obvious question. What do we actually mean when we talk about a digital presence? It's sort of a vague term if you just look at it like that. So broadly speaking, when I'm talking about it today, I'm talking about your visibility online, your presence on the various social media platforms, and how easy it is for people to find you, to engage with your work, and to support you. So as I alluded to at the beginning of the webinar, artists have been increasingly dependent on developing a digital presence in recent years, but this hasn't been the case for everyone. So while it's been absolutely essential for some artists, depending on where they're located, what discipline they work in, what networks they're plugged into, other artists have really been able to maintain their practice without one. And while I do understand some people's reticence to want to wade into the digital realm unless it's absolutely necessary, I think a lot of that apprehension that some people feel is based on misconceptions. So sometimes it can be about age or feeling like social media is only for young people and that it's too late to learn. I would say that's definitely not the case. All it really takes is an open mind and a bit of practice. Some people often think as well that they're either too shy or that you need to be some sort of shameless self-promoter for it to really be worthwhile. This really isn't true either. If you do interesting work, people want to hear about it. And you can find a way of sharing your work without bombarding people. In fact, your chances will be better off that way. So misconceptions aside, COVID-19 has made it abundantly clear how important this is, certainly in the short term, but in the long term as well. So artists who were previously able to get by with in-person or local networks suddenly find themselves at a disadvantage and are having to play catch up. The good news is that getting started with building your digital presence is relatively straightforward and can provide a lot of benefits for your work. It can be a great way of generating more professional opportunities outside of your existing network as you make and develop new contacts. It also increases the potential for more opportunities in other places. So really depending on your discipline, the more things have started to shift to online during COVID-19, the more you can pursue gigs in locations remotely. You'll of course need a strong digital presence to make the case for yourself since you're not dealing with people that already know you. It's also a great way to engage with your audience directly and really expand your audience. And even for local gigs, things like a thoughtful and well-maintained social media profile or an artist website can serve as a ready-made portfolio and CV that can be helpful for things like grant applications, submissions for calls for works, and so on. But it does require some consideration beforehand that will determine how you can maintain it in the longer term. You should be asking yourself things like, what are my goals? So are you looking to strengthen your network locally during the pandemic? Or are you more interested in reaching a more geographically diverse audience? You can also ask yourself things like, what kind of increase in followers on social media are you aiming for? Really try to quantify it. You can also ask yourself questions like, where do I want to focus my time and energy? So really, what platforms or tools do you want to prioritize? How much time and energy can I realistically invest? Because it's important to remember that it's not just a matter of, say, creating an Instagram profile and waiting for people to find you. It's, in a sense, a lot like tending a garden. You have to plant the seeds at the start, but then you have to nourish them after that to really get results. And you should also be asking, what limits do I need to set for myself? Because we all know that things like really intense social media use can sneak up on you and have adverse effects. So rather than speaking in generalities with questions like this, let's get down to business and talk about how you can actually build your digital presence and all of the relevant considerations for your chosen method of going about it. And what better place to start than social media? So while a digital presence doesn't simply mean having a social media profile and posting content, it is more than that. It is no secret that these platforms are a huge part of any artist's arsenal of promotional tools and a really useful way of building an engaged and loyal audience. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about how you can have a productive approach to social media in general before getting into some specifics about how and why you should use certain platforms and how to focus your efforts. So to begin, I want to talk about how you should approach social media. And I think there are three main things that I want to highlight here. One is a matter of how you present yourself. The second is about how you engage with the platforms. And the third is about which platforms you actually use. So the first thing I want to stress about social media is that authenticity is important. I think it really comes across when you're just sort of going through the motions or faking enthusiasm for your followers. The idea that you have to present yourself this way is something that I think makes some people really reticent to get on social media based on their personality. And again, that's a misconception. If you're naturally outgoing, sure, that's great. If you're, say, more reserved or shy or have a hard time, wanting to promote yourself, don't feel like you have to adopt some sort of forced persona for your social media presence. It's not about being your own cheerleader just for the sake of it. It's about presenting the interesting work you do in an authentic way so that people can know what you're about. That being said, while you want to be authentic, you also want to create a clear separation between personal and professional social media. So while you may already have a personal social media profile on a given platform where you sometimes share your work, I think it's really important to create a separate, let's call it a brand page, for your professional activities. You can, of course, then invite your personal friends to like and follow that page later. And I think this is important because you really don't want to clutter your profile with personal content that distracts from your work. People who use social media effectively, I think, are good at injecting just enough of a personal touch to help connect and engage with their audience without crossing that line. The other part of your approach that I want to highlight is knowing how these platforms actually work. So while some, like Twitter, give you the option to see posts in the order that they were submitted, most social media platforms now filter and present content algorithmically. So what do we mean by algorithmically? Simply put, it's a series of rules that are programmed into the platform that determine what gets showed to who and when. So just because you click submit on a post doesn't necessarily mean all of your followers are going to see it right away. By extension, it becomes necessary to some degree to know how to play the algorithm. This is a complicated subject because these algorithms function based on both general tendencies, but they're also tailored to individual users' habits, and it's not always totally transparent how exactly this works. So I've included a few links in the resource sheet in the slides that can offer you some food for thought on this subject. But generally speaking, you'll want to consider things like what time of day do you post? How many posts do you make a day? How many people typically view or engage with your posts? And whether your posts contain things like hashtags, images, or videos. And for those of you not familiar with hashtags, they're the terms that begin with the pound symbol or number sign, which allow people to click on them and then view other posts on a given platform that are using the same tag. So it's a really great way to expand outside your current network organically by finding people with shared interests. But also, of course, don't overdo it. Adding every hashtag imaginable, looks like spam. It looks like you're sort of being careless, and people will tend to sort of ignore that. But at the end of the day, talking about these algorithms, don't get too hung up on them because to some degree it is out of your control. But just try to keep it in mind when you determine what kind of content you want to share and how and when you actually want to present it. Lastly, I think it's important to consider which platforms to use, why to use them, and how many to really sink your teeth into. And to do this, you need to know their strengths and weaknesses, obviously. So I'll go into more detail on that in a moment. But try to think about things like, what is the audience that I'm aiming for? What kinds of content do I like to share? What do I want my profile to look like? How much information do I want to be available through that profile? And do I prefer to use my computer or my mobile device when I access my social media account? In general, I really suggest you try to focus on just one or two platforms rather than spreading yourself too thin, at least at the beginning. If you really like doing it or you're more experienced, by all means try for more. But if it is out of your comfort zone, it's a good idea to start small. Some of you may already be on one or more platforms, which is great. In which case, rather than just automatically thinking that you need to expand to other ones, you can also think about deepening the engagement within the networks that you already have. So without further ado, let's take a look at your main options. So first, obviously, we have Facebook, which is maybe not as popular as it once was, but is still super widely used and a great way to connect with lots of different people. It's probably also the most full-featured of the platforms I'm going to discuss, as I think it gives you the most options for how you want to use it. So you can upload photos and videos and then really manage and organize them into galleries. You can do live streaming on there, which is super cool. When it comes to written content, you have more space for longer posts compared to other platforms. It's really great, obviously, for interaction with comments and likes from the people you follow or who follow you. And it also gives you more space for profile information compared to some of the other platforms. So people who find your profile can learn all about you and your work really just in one place without having to search elsewhere. As one downside, I know that Facebook has lost the younger demographic somewhat in recent years to platforms like Instagram and TikTok. So that's one consideration to bear in mind depending on your audience, but as I mentioned, still very widely used. Next, we have Twitter, which is an interesting, albeit I think a challenging platform. It's primarily text-based, although you can include sort of photos and videos. But it gives you a much more limited amount of characters to use compared to Facebook. That character limit means you really need to be succinct. So it's perhaps better for linking to things off platform and sort of more light conversation rather than really posting at length about your work. I think it's harder to get engagement because you really need to be active and it moves very fast. So your content can get lost. But if you do manage to get to grips with Twitter, it can be great for engagement with a wider group or community via things like hashtags or sharing other people's tweets and then sharing yours. So in a way, I'd say that Twitter is almost better for networking than for just building an audience. But of course, your mileage may vary on that. So subsequently, we have Instagram, which is a really fun and engaging platform, and I think a nice complement to something like Facebook when used in tandem. It's primarily a visual medium, so photo or video is essential. You'll need to decide if you'll take full advantage of that. You can, of course, include text with your posts. Not all users spend the same amount of time reading on the platform. Some are really just there to look at cool photos and videos. They don't want to read the text. So Instagram is also a really good platform for hashtags in your post. A lot of people can be exposed to your work that way if you use them effectively. A few considerations to keep in mind, though. Instagram is primarily intended for use with mobile devices. There is a website that you can look at on your computer. I find it a bit clunky. So you'll want to make sure that you're comfortable with a mobile approach if you want to post and engage effectively. It's also not great for sharing links. So if you write, say, like a website in your post to link to some really great work you've been doing, it's just going to show up as plain text. People can't click it. It ends up just being kind of useless. So this has resulted in the now common phrase, link in bio, where you ask people to use the one single clickable link that you're afforded in your main profile. There are sort of strategies for getting around that, but it is a bit of an annoyance. But all in all, Instagram is a really great and popular platform, and I think definitely one worth looking into. As I mentioned, there's also TikTok, which is a newer platform that's really popular with young people and a potentially hugely untapped resource depending on your niche. It's mainly video-based, gives users between 3 and 60 seconds to work with. It's also primarily for mobile devices rather than your computer. It's quite fast-paced, honestly can be a bit overwhelming in my limited experience. So it's not a platform you want to choose for a traditional approach to sharing your work. But if you do get into the spirit of things, it can be a really fun and creative way of building an audience. And I've lumped the rest of these under the others category, partly we're just because we're so limited for time, not because they're necessarily less important. So Pinterest, for example, is a medium that can be really good for generating sales if used effectively. YouTube is, of course, huge and a really great platform, but it does benefit, I think, from videos with a higher production value. And that sort of really intense video content creation can be time-consuming and technically difficult as well. LinkedIn can be really handy as an online CV and as a networking tool, but it's definitely one of the less social of the social media platforms in terms of actual sort of quality interaction. So of course, choosing your platforms and setting up a social media profile is only the beginning. Once you're on there, the best way to start growing a following and ensure yourself some visibility is to begin sharing content. And you want to make sure you're sharing content that is engaging, that is fun, that is thought-provoking, and that makes people want to see more of what you're doing. But content is a bit of a vague and unhelpful word, I think. It doesn't actually give you a sense of what specifically you should be posting. So I'll quickly run through some ideas. You could be posting things like photos of your finished pieces or videos of your artworks. Can also be really interesting to post works in progress and behind the scenes photo or video. You can include a video or photo walkthrough of your studio, show people where you work. You can include photos or video of exhibitions or performances you've done. And you can also use it to post how-tos or tutorials to take a more sort of educational approach. As far as other things you'll want to keep in mind about content, producing it does take time and effort depending on what you're doing. So be mindful of that. And also be mindful of what platforms you want to use and budget your time accordingly. So written content is cheap and relatively easy, whereas video, as I said, there's a certain production value that people kind of expect. So you'll want to keep that in mind. Of course, you'll also want to approach these options differently depending on your art practice and your technical capabilities. So if you're a musician, you may find that video works much better than photo because you're actually able to include sound on there. People can hear your music. Whereas the painter might be better off with a high quality photo of their work rather than a shaky iPhone video of dubious quality. In terms of more general advice, try not to post the same kind of content all the time. People are scrolling through a ton of stuff all the time, and it becomes very easy for them to pass over your posts, whether that's consciously or not, simply by virtue of it being overly familiar. So try to keep things varied within reason. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but it is important to keep it fresh. You'll also want to pay attention to what kinds of posts do better than others. See what people like most about what you're doing and try to keep that in mind when you pick what you want to be posting. One of the most important parts of using social media as an artist is being able to measure the impact and the reach on these platforms. So using analytics that measure the data of who engages with your posts can be a useful way of doing that, but these tools are not essential depending on your experience level. Certainly, if you have a lot of followers and there's a ton of people visiting your profiles, having tools that measure the data for you can admittedly be a huge help. But if you're just starting out, they might be an unnecessary learning curve without too much benefit. They do have sort of more specific uses that can be valuable, like telling you who exactly is liking your posts, where they come from, things like that. But of course, in all of this, it's important to come into it with a healthy dose of perspective, I think. You'll want to set reasonable expectations for yourself to ensure that social media remains a positive tool for you and not a source of discouragement. When you transition from using social media as a personal activity to using it as a tool to promote your work, it's really easy to get obsessed with growth and stress over things like increasing your number of followers at all costs. But it's important to remember that organic growth is the goal, and that's actually quite hard. You can follow, 1,000 other accounts in the hope that most of them will follow you back, but there's no guarantee that many of them will. And even if they do, it doesn't mean that that connection will really add value to your digital presence. So don't get discouraged if it's slow at first, or even if you do eventually hit a wall, because sometimes you do hit a limit on growth. You should obviously try different approaches to get creative to get around that, but sometimes it is out of your hands. This can be due to external factors, or sometimes just the fact that you're dealing with a niche audience for what you do. At the end of the day, improving the quality of engagement with your followers can be meaningful progress enough. So having a loyal following is, I think, really crucial for independent artists. And depending on your practice, having 10 people who regularly purchase or support your work can be much more beneficial than having 10,000 followers who periodically like something that you post. So don't get too focused on the numbers, but really consider the quality of engagement. Before we move on, I also want to bring up a really important point that I think sometimes gets overlooked. As I think we're all increasingly aware, social media can be a really psychologically and emotionally taxing thing. It affects people differently. Some are a lot more sensitive to the negative effects. This can be due to the amount of screen time that is involved. Could be a matter of finding interacting with followers to be a bit draining, particularly if you're dealing with sort of negative comments. Or it could be the kind of competitive nature of constantly comparing yourself to other people's popularity that leads to feelings of being discouraged. So while I think that social media is definitely a great and really useful tool that I encourage you to use, don't overdo it and try to be mindful of your own needs. So for example, you can schedule a specific amount of time for it in your day, like you would a task at any other job, depending on what you intend to do and how much energy you have to put into it. Many platforms also allow you to automatically schedule posts. So for example, you can take an hour to plan all of your posts for the day and then check in briefly later on to engage with comments rather than spend all day logged in and refreshing the page. And you really do want to resist that urge to be constantly checking your profile for updates. At the end of the day, not only is this better for you, I think, but it also gives you a better chance of using social media more effectively and more positively to grow your digital presence. So as we know by now, social media, major part of presenting your work online and growing your audience. But another often overlooked aspect of a successful digital presence is having your own artist website. So in my experience, I would say this is maybe not as essential for everyone and every situation compared to social media, but neither is social media really an adequate replacement for your own professional website. So what are the main advantages of having an artist website? To put it very broadly, control. Social media platforms control what information you can share, how it's presented, who does or doesn't see it, and they typically exercise that control with very little transparency to users. You're also at the whim of how many people are using that platform. So anybody who devoted a serious amount of time to maintaining their MySpace profile, what seems like a lifetime ago, they found out the hard way that things can change quite fast and people will move on to the shiny new thing if they get the sense that other people are doing the same. So instead, your own professional website is a great resource to have as a solid and easy to access profile for your work online. It's a great way to host your portfolio and artist bio. You can share your contact information so people can easily reach you via email or otherwise. You can personalize how it looks, have it better represent your aesthetic than, say, a Facebook profile. And I would add that it does contribute to a sense of professionalism, provided you do a good job of representing yourself. So if somebody Googles your work looking for a website, but only finds a couple of social media profiles, it can sometimes give the sense, albeit unfairly, that you're not a serious or professional artist. So how do you go about creating your own website, and what should you keep in mind when doing so? Obviously, this is quite an involved subject. I'm going to walk you through the steps broadly, but to save time and not dish out too much information, I've included more detailed links in the slides to not overwhelm you. So to begin with, you'll need to get yourself a web domain name and a host. So the domain name is basically the address people will type in to visit your website. The host is the company that runs the server space where your website data will be stored and that ensures that your website is always accessible. So for that reason, you definitely do not want to skimp here. You want to prioritize picking a reliable host that fits your budget. There are lots to choose from, and as I mentioned, there are several included in the resource sheet that I've prepared for you. As tempting as it is, you also want to avoid free domains or hosting packages. They tend to include a lot of ads that can be distracting and kind of leave a bad impression. Hosts offer monthly plans at a variety of different rates, giving you different options for your budget, such as the amount of data you need to store on your server, the amount of available bandwidth, so meaning the amount of data that your host has to send out every time somebody accesses your site. Most average websites, from what I've seen, tend to use around 5 gigabytes per month, but that can vary depending on your needs. And sometimes different plans offer different access to tech support services, which depending on your experience level can be super, super useful. When it comes to actually building your site, again, you have a ton of options. You can, of course, hire someone, but there are a lot of really good free or affordable website building tools out there. Again, I've linked to a bunch of them. Hiring a web designer might be better for something that's really elaborate or custom, but that's not really totally necessary. In fact, you want to keep your website not too convoluted and not overly flashy anyway. Simple design and ease of navigation are vital, particularly for making your website accessible on mobile devices, which is very important these days. So visitors to your site should very quickly have a sense of what information or content is available and where they need to go to view it. So you'll want to make sure that there aren't too many menu links on your site, just the most important things like a kind of portfolio for your work, a bio about you, a resume or CV, a link to buy your work if possible, and of course your contact information and links to your social media. You'll want to avoid too much text as that can be a turnoff. So again, try to be succinct because it is really easy for people to load up a site and be put off by it at first glance and just end up going somewhere else. One of the most important things to remember is that you need to keep your website active and up to date. It's not just a matter of planting the flag to claim your little piece of the internet. It has to be a useful resource that tells people what you're doing. If there's not much recent activity on your website, it can give the false impression that your career isn't particularly active or that you're not that committed to your art. Ultimately, whether the time, money, and energy dedicated toward an artist's website is worthwhile will vary depending on your situation, but the tools and resources are available to make setting one up fun and fairly painless. So much like social media, see if you can budget the time for it to set one up and regularly update your content. And you can, of course, reuse some of your content from social media. Of course, it's one thing to put your work on a professional website or social media. It's another thing to actually get people to find it without directing them there yourself. So on that note, I'm going to briefly cover two more advanced topics, albeit in broad strokes, just to get you thinking about how you can go about this. A full discussion of these topics is unfortunately beyond the scope of the hour that we have together today, but I've once again linked to a bunch of useful resources in the Google Sheet that I've prepared for you. So the first topic I want to talk about is SEO, or search engine optimization. This is sort of an added consideration for thinking about why you might want an artist webpage and how to go about it. In the most general sense, SEO is all about the strategies you can employ to make it easier for people to find you when they do a Google search on a search or a search on an engine like Google or Bing. Not just when they search your name, but also when they search for words or phrases that might be related to you or your work. Basically, how search engines work is by using crawlers or bots that scan websites for a variety of information that then helps them generate relevant results when somebody does a search. So SEO is all about trying to game that process by strategically including the kinds of words and information that you think people might search for in relation to your work, and putting those into the parts of your website where those crawlers know to look. You do this by adding code that gives your web page a title, as well as description for individual pages and images on your site. You'll want to add a good amount of keywords related to your work, but you also don't want to overdo it and include every word in the dictionary. Crawlers will recognize that, and it can actually end up harming your SEO. You'll also want to keep in mind for any images you use as well. So when you're uploading images, you want to use descriptive file names as much as possible. So for example, naming an image oil painting of a sunset rather than image 123. Alt text or alternative text for image descriptions also helps your images turn up in Google image searches. So you can integrate SEO techniques by yourself by entering the code manually, or have a web developer take care of it. But any good web design tool, something like Squarespace, will have all the necessary tools to help you add SEO content in an easy and straightforward way. But it's more than just a bunch of keywords stuffed into the code of your page. SEO is also dependent on the actual written text on your website. So the language and terms that you use, for example, in your artist statement or in describing a workshop that you offer, should be sufficiently descriptive and use common terms that people might use when they search for, say, a visual artist or a school workshop facilitator. SEO is really more for your artist website than for your social media, as you don't have as much control over the code in, say, your Facebook and Instagram. But they do have a reciprocal relationship. So having social media profiles can help increase your findability in a Google search. And similarly, more people visiting your website can help increase the number of people engaging with your social media profiles. So to quickly summarize, there are all kinds of approaches to optimizing your SEO performance. People can really obsess over this. It's become a major marketing industry unto itself. For most people's purposes, just being aware of what SEO is and making efforts to incorporate it into your website by, say, using the web building tools you're using, making use of their SEO functionality, that can be a great start and a great way of increasing your digital presence. Another way of, say, supercharging your digital presence that is a little bit less known, but that I want to touch on, involves using Wikidata. So what is Wikidata? It is, as they describe it on their site, a free and open knowledge base that can be read and edited by both humans and machines. So that means not only can you browse through Wikidata for information on people, places, or things, but also machines, so software that people have written, can easily and automatically incorporate that data into things like websites and databases. So Wikidata becomes the main repository for all the structured data that gets used on related platforms like Wikipedia. So when I say structured, I mean that data is pre-formatted in a specific way that makes it easy to read by machines and software, and then to plug it into a variety of different uses. And all that data is available under a free license, so it's easy to incorporate across the web. So if you were looking to create your own Wikidata entry, you'd be able to provide a range of basic and more specific information about yourself, such as your name, country of origin, your occupation, but also things like the institution that you attended, your school and at what time, any prizes or awards that you've received, a link to your website, and quite a lot more. So what are the actual advantages to having information about your artist career formatted as Wikidata? Essentially, it means that all the information is simply entered once and can then be easily used in a ton of different ways across the internet. So think of it as a way of automatically expanding your digital presence, or at least creating the capability for it to be expanded. So for example, information on Wikidata can be used to automatically populate info boxes in Wikipedia entries with all the most useful information about you. It can be used to generate Google Knowledge cards, which are those really useful panels that sometimes pop up on the right side of the page when you Google someone or something. So on your screen, you can see some examples of that. We have a dog and a lamb, two things that everybody loves. So this not only presents the most useful information about you at a glance for people searching you, I think it also enhances your status. People think, wow, this person is noteworthy enough that Google is giving me all this information automatically. Wikidata is admittedly maybe a bit intimidating at first glance because it does require an understanding of the conventions of how you need to format the data to make it readable. But once you get the basics down, it applies to all the common data you need to enter. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are minimum criteria you have to meet to be able to be included in Wikidata. But the good news is that they're not as stringent compared to, say, adding yourself to Wikipedia. And I've included a link in my resource sheet that tells you exactly what you need to know about that. So, as I mentioned, this is definitely a more advanced topic and not for everyone, but potentially a really cool way for you to expand your digital presence with fairly minimal effort. And if you're interested, again, please check out the resources that I've prepared for you. That also includes a link to a really cool workshop series on Wikidata for artists that's being offered by Capicoa and CQT. They're offering these workshops in English remotely, so you can watch recordings of previous sessions and register for upcoming ones as well. The next one is on December 10th. I attended my first one recently. It was really great, really informative, and a cool way to get started. So before we wrap up, I want to quickly take a moment to acknowledge that some of us are working in really specific contexts as artists, and that has implications for the kind of content we're able to share online. So this is specifically important to take into consideration for anyone joining us today who works with Alain's Art Ed project, offering workshops to students. Fortunately, Louise from the Art Ed team has prepared some really handy guidelines, which I've included. So first, when it comes to knowing what communications are appropriate, by all means, follow the school's lead. You can review the school's website or social media pages to get a better sense of what that is. You can also identify who manages the social media for the school that you're working with and discuss their policy with them to make sure that everything is absolutely crystal clear. You can also send content to the teacher or school to post, which makes it easier. And you can send them things such as images, pictures of materials or works in progress. You can send them text like description of activities, your own reflections on work that you've been doing in schools. You can also include links and tags to your website or your professional social media profiles. So for instance, as Art Ed artists, you can use tags like @AlainArtEd, #AlainArtEd, and #ArtistsInspireGrants. The most important thing to consider is the question of permission, and following those guidelines will certainly help you navigate that. Because you're of course dealing with minors, so when it comes to sharing, say, photos from a really great workshop, you have to keep in mind that permission is required to be able to share those images, out of respect to those young people's privacy and safety. When it comes to those permissions, it is up to the school or an organization that you're working with, like ELAN, to obtain students' permission. So a great way to avoid problems and to know exactly what you can share is to once again follow the school or ELAN's lead. Share content that they have already shared, as that way you can be sure that the necessary permissions have been obtained. To avoid issues altogether, you can also share content in the form of your own images and videos of your work that you produce during a workshop, or your written reflections on the experience. So that way the question of students' permissions is avoided altogether, but you can still let people know all about the great work that you're doing. Your choice of which platforms that you want to share that content on can also vary as an artist working in schools. So for example, Facebook is a great choice if you're looking to reach and interact with schools, teachers, and parents. Instagram is a better bet for interacting with young people. And Twitter is a really good option for interacting with educators for professional development purposes. So while there are some really important extra steps that you do need to take as art ed artists, it's still extremely beneficial to develop a digital presence, and it's worth the effort. And it can certainly help you with your ability to find more interesting work opportunities in the future. So on that note, I'm going to pass things over to Louise to offer her own perspective and a few words of encouragement.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. That was a really fantastic overview. I've certainly learned a lot from what you've already presented. I just wanted to emphasize that when you're working with schools, when we're talking about permissions, it has to do with use of a student's face and their creative product. So just to underline, it's up to the school or an organization to obtain a student's permissions. Schools get this at the beginning of the year, and it applies to the entire year. And this is something it is very, very important to make sure that you are respecting those permissions. And it's just my rule of thumb is to post my own reflections, post my own work, post things that don't have students at all in it. And generally that is a good way to go. Nick, do you want me to talk about my experience of getting onto social media now?
Yeah, sure, if you'd like.
Okay, so I am sort of your classic artist who didn't want to have anything to do with social media. This was probably about 4 years ago, and at a certain point, I started to get a little frustrated about not getting the kind of work that I felt was really in my wheelhouse. And I kind of came to the conclusion that I wasn't getting that work because I wasn't telling people about what I was good at and what I was passionate about. So I really had to take myself in hand and decide how I was going to go about doing it. And it really echoes a lot of what Nick has already said about I needed to find the platforms I was comfortable on. I needed to find the ways that I was comfortable sharing things, what I wanted to share. A way for interacting with all of these platforms that fits with me, my work, and my personality. So I started very simply, and I actually hired a very good friend and colleague of mine who is a comms person, and told her, her name's Ananda Sudat, she's fantastic. And I told her, it's like, if I don't have to be responsible to somebody to actually follow through on this, I'm not going to do it. So she really walked me through being able to set up a website, set up my own newsletter, email send outs, and set up all of my social media. And I have to say it has served me very, very well. Having done this for 3 to 4 years now, I know exactly certain contracts have come through my website. When the OSM was looking for somebody to do cultural mediation, they did a Google search and they found me. When it came to social media, I find that my way of doing things is to post inspirational kind of posts, feel good stories, and trying to share ways that other people can do arts themselves. I know for a fact that I've gotten a lot of work through schools because of this. I've also found it very handy in terms of welcoming people into my process and connecting with people that are just far beyond my actual personal, what I can get to myself, people that I can access every single day. So if you're hesitant and really digging your heels in about creating a digital presence, I'm kind of here to tell you that it's possible. It's been really beneficial for me. And I think the key is really, as Nick has been saying, to find the way that you are comfortable and actually enjoy interacting with the people that you want to reach, because it is a conversation. I see it as a conversation starter. So for example, my newsletter, I just sent it out this morning. I've already got a few people who've emailed me back with comments about what I was writing them about. And it's a conversation that develops and builds over time that eventually leads to projects together, or maybe deepening understanding of who people are as artists, and eventually, contracts. I think that pretty much sums it up. Nick, would you like me to say anything else?
No, that was great. I think it's really good to take it out of, take it out of the abstract and actually provide your own experience. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, it really is, to once again echo that thought. It really is just about finding the way that works best for you. You don't need to push yourself into doing something that you're not comfortable with doing, but find something that's fun and engaging, and it can really be beneficial.